Hello, my name is Joanne Lebert. I'm the Executive Director of Impact, a non-governmental, non-profit organization that's existed since 1986. We focus on natural resource management in areas where security and human rights are at risk. And our areas of focus are regulatory and legal reform, supply chain transparency, illicit trade and financing, environmental stewardship, and gender equality. And today I want to speak to you about women's economic empowerment and gender equality in artisanal mining. Specifically, to be true to the theme of the lesson, why investment in these things are important. What we have learned since we and others first started to better understand the roles, realities, barriers, and opportunities for women in ASM, and how can we achieve these goals. Now, already in the lecture, we've touched upon why ASM is a gender issue, but I want to reiterate that of the 41 million people directly engaged in ASM globally, it's estimated that a minimum of 30% of the workforce are women. That's a World Bank estimate. And of course, what defines women's inequality ranges from limited access to assets, unequal price being paid for a commodity being mined, and so their incomes tend to be lower than men's. The digging as part of one of the roles in an artisanal supply chain tends to be one of the more lucrative positions, at least upstream. And typically women participate less in the more lucrative parts of the supply chain. And so our research in Africa's Great Lakes region has demonstrated that 15% of women versus 62% of men are diggers. Of course, another domain that's essentially defined by gender inequality is leadership. They tend to have less access to decision-making, production. There's very much an unequal division of labor. And finally, time. They have very little say on how their time is managed, because when they are not laboring for paid work, they're working for free. Unpaid work, childcare, household management consumes a great deal of their time, but also distracts them or takes them away from opportunities for remuneration. Now, of course, gender inequality underpins the vulnerabilities and inequalities faced by women and girls. When we talk about sexual and gender-based violence, fundamentally at the root of those violences are or is gender inequality. And so these things are all interlinked. And gender inequality is exacerbated in the ASM sector because it's a poverty-driven sector. It occurs largely in informality, and so it tends to be hidden away, or women's participation tends to be largely unknown. It is a sector that is potentially a relatively lucrative and also prone to predation as a result, especially in conflict-affected areas. Now, why is ASM important for women? Well, it's important for women and men, but even more so for women. Because women consistently, and this might surprise you, but women consistently earn more in mine sites than outside of mine sites, at least in DRC, Uganda, and Rwanda. It'd be great to collect information, statistics about other parts of the world about this. For example, in Rwanda, men typically earn 30% more in mine sites than outside of mine sites, at least of the mine sites that were surveyed as part of a research project we carried out with BUS and other academics and partners between November 2017 and 2019. For women, however, if it's 30% higher for men, in the mining sector, it's 223 times more lucrative for women carrying out activities in mine sites than outside of mine sites. In Uganda, 64% more in mine sites than outside of mine sites. And for women, it's 335% more lucrative to carry out activities related to mining than outside of mining. So already we can see the allure of working in the sector, and what's really needed is for support for women and men to work more safely and on their own terms. And of course, women tend to contribute more to the well-being of their households and their dependents, and which is also why it's important to support women in ASM. Now, this all very much underscores the importance of gender and formalization more broadly, and women's participation and recognition of women's key part or key contribution to supply chain transparency, or what we call due diligence, and responsible business conduct. They are part of that solution. And why is that the case? Well, first of all, one of the questions I often get asked is, why not simply take women out of the sector? Yes, it might be more lucrative, but they're so vulnerable. Why not remove them? Well, removing them, first of all, removes their autonomy. It's a decision they should be free to make under the right conditions, of course. But to remove them might actually increase their vulnerability and marginalization because, well, first of all, like I said, some women want to mine, and we don't want to undermine women's independence and autonomy. We want to work in support of women. But if they don't have access to a mine site, and we've seen this in several mine sites, particularly, again, in Africa's Great Lakes region and in Congo in particular, some of the mine sites where we've witnessed women being essentially barred entry, they have then had to turn to their male counterparts to have access to the ore, especially gold, which is extremely lucrative and essentially acts as commodity, as cash. And so access to gold, access to cash is very important in order to achieve a certain degree of, economic security and stability. And if they don't have access to the mine site, they are forced to actually go through their male counterparts or sometimes to negotiate with a mine site holder, which can be extremely perilous and puts them on a very vulnerable footing. As well, any sort of exclusion from cash, any sort of exclusion from the gold can also lessen their status because these things are also status bearing. If you bring gold, cash, and you're able to demonstrate you can invest in an association or in a cooperative or in a structure, you have greater say, you have greater decision-making access. And so these things, if we don't support women to access ore directly, which is extremely lucrative, or if we ban them from mine sites, we essentially potentially increase their vulnerabilities. So ultimately, it's about creating or supporting access to safe working conditions and to choice. Furthermore, formalization and responsible production and trade, responsible business conduct really requires women. Women are key to success because data has shown that women are more loyal to legality. They are more willing to engage in things like traceability and supply chain due diligence and transparency. In times of insecurity, pandemics, epidemics, armed conflict, or other sort of violences, or other types of insecurity writ large, they tend to have slower rates of disengagement from these commitments to, again, legality, due diligence, traceability. They also tend to be more committed to environmental stewardship, as proven by our data in the Great Lakes region of Africa and Congo in particular. So they're really key to transforming the sector into a vector for development. And yet, because women's mining work tends to be invisible, devalued, limited, altogether excluded, seemingly neutral interventions can actually have negative impacts and further entrench gender equality and make women even more insecure, especially in conflict settings. So to give you an example, when we think of responsible business conduct or responsible sourcing, which essentially aims to ensure that the production and trade of a commodity is done in a way that meets international or regional standards so that we can deem it, conflict-free or clean, for instance. And so consumers can know that they're doing no harm. However, through some of our interventions, our own project interventions as an NGO, where these type of initiatives were introduced, notably through one of our projects called Just Gold in the DRC, while the supply chain was proven to be clean, our data analytics were showing, and it's all gender disaggregated, our data analytics were showing early on that men's incomes were increasing as a result of responsible business conduct and responsible supply chains, but women's income was either unchanged or had even slightly decreased. Thus, we were actually inadvertently contributing to gender inequality, which actually runs against the commitments of our organization. And then, so that information allowed us to course correct and bring in complementary programming and really name some of the structural barriers and respond to that in such a way to really support women to assume greater leadership, greater access to role, greater production, many of the things that I listed early on. And after several months, we did see essentially that gap close, and in fact, women's income surpassing men's. So a seemingly neutral intervention like responsible sourcing might make those of us who are buying these goods feel like we're empowering a community, but communities are heterogeneous spaces, and we want to make sure that women benefit as much as men, but that we're also contributing to women's economic power, empowerment, and gender equality. So we really need to ask the hard questions and not assume that these interventions, however well intended, are essentially having essentially organically having a positive impact. We need to be monitoring closely and not making that assumption. A second example is formalization, and one of the typical milestones, let's say, of formalization is the acquisition of a license, a mining license, or grouping miners into cooperatives in a kind of a formal, legally recognized structure. Now, typically licensing procedures in many of the countries of Africa and even globally tend to be bureaucratic. They tend to be based in a city. They tend to be legalistic, requiring literacy. They also require comfort with navigating bureaucracy and interacting with male government officials. These are consistently things that women tend to be disadvantaged at compared to their male counterparts. You know, they are not as familiar with the legal code or a mining code. Statistics prove that. They have lower levels of literacy. They have less experience navigating bureaucracy, and of course, interacting with male officials in particular can be not only intimidating, in some contexts, it's actually taboo. So these are examples of structural inequalities, barriers that are very likely to have an acute impact on whether or not women can essentially achieve improved economic security or empowerment, or if gender equality can be achieved in the sector. These are things we don't typically see. And so these are called structural inequalities, and these are really at the root of what we need to get at. So seemingly neutral interventions, however well-intended, formalization, responsible business conduct, responsible supply chains, can have a negative impact unintentionally, and in fact further entrench gender inequality and make women even more insecure. And I underline again, especially in conflict settings where they're already so vulnerable. So what have we learned then? Well, we've learned that changes to the sector should not assumed to be gender neutral or to benefit women and men equally. Fundamentally, there is a difference between gender programming and gender integration. Gender programming can be programs that benefit women, but may not get at these kind of transformational issues that we really need to address if gender equality is to be sustained, achieved in a lasting sort of way. We really need to get at, name the root of power and work at it together in order to ensure essentially the realization of SDG 5 and gender equality. So while women's programming has a place and can benefit women, it doesn't necessarily get at the root of gender inequality. And that's really what we need to do to transform the sector and support women. So when we design our programs, when we design our interventions, when we design mining reform policy, gender needs to be at the center of design, of implementation, of monitoring and learning. It really requires a different outlook. And it's not, doing the work and then essentially inserting gender or, adding women. It's really about identifying at each step where there might be unequal power. Again, let's acknowledge that communities are heterogeneous. Think of your own community. Not everybody is equal. Who is disadvantaged when new things come to play? Who are the first ones to benefit? And we have to kind of change our thinking to ask the right questions. And that takes a lot of training. You know, the identification of where power rests and the identification of structural inequalities and the barriers and how we can address them. And here are examples of the type of, let's say, domains or components that we need to look at and ask ourselves these questions for all of them. Where does power lie? Where may there be inequalities? Whether it's work relations within mining areas, institutions, and at home, such as the division of work between women and men in the mining communities, not just in the supply chain or at the pit, but in the home as well. What roles of women and men are there in governance structures? How may they differ? Then there's personal and family relations, different roles and tasks that women and men perform in the home, how women and men relate differently with children and adults in that home. Then there are rules and norms related to gender in the mining community, social and legal rules that dictate how women and men behave in the mining community. What are they? And as well, another gender component is access to and distribution and use of resources, different resources to which women and men have access and control of over in the mining community. So understanding these things is critical to making sure that we're not creating or introducing interventions that exacerbate existing differences and actually make gender equality even less attainable, no matter how well intended we are. Once these kind of questions are identified, then we can mitigate and monitor and see if we're on the path to realizing gender equality and women's empowerment. And I'd like to draw your attention here to a toolkit that our organization developed that will be published in the fall of 2020 with the support of Government of Canada. And it precisely lays out for each of these sections the types of questions that should be asked to map power. You know, questions that are not always that apparent. For example, around licensing, like those elements that I raised earlier. So it goes through each of these components, essentially presenting the type of questions that should be asked, and then guiding people or users to apply it in their own work, whether they are themselves involved in projects related to ASM formalization or involved in the development and implementation of policies related to artisanal and small-scale mining. So I encourage you to take a look out for that, but keep an eye out for that. Another thing we've learned, and this is still maybe a hypothesis to be tested, but it certainly bears out in other sectors, not just in artisanal mining. But the type of programming that transforms gender bias into artisanal mining, once we've gone through and identified where power rests and where those structural barriers are, some of the most effective approaches have been carried out in a particular order or particular sequencing. And the more vulnerable a community, such as in a conflict-affected area, the more the community and households essentially sit on the edge of survival, essentially. The starting point is typically about economic security. Issues of environmental stewardship, issues of solidarity, those happen at a later stage. The most immediate concern is survival and economic security. And so in our own work in the Congo, once we carried out the research and identified, again, those structural barriers, which we validated and discussed with the community. So there's a degree of consciousness raising. Economic security, again, was a critical milestone that allowed, that acted as a stepping stone to other means of achieving and realizing women's empowerment and transforming gender bias. Specifically, a financial inclusion project that was building off existing experiences of village savings and loans. And so it came quite easily to women and men in disenfranchised community and fragile environments. They already had similar systems, and to support them, to help them flourish and to grow their savings under those conditions was a first step to economic security. And there was a women's empowerment element that was very much a key ingredient of that. Then came quite organically the development of a network of women in artisanal mining communities. This is still in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So once that financial inclusion piece was in place, the women who had participated in that themselves started to form into an association, and we saw greater social cohesion. Then they themselves asked for support to carry out conflict prevention and conflict mitigation in their communities. So once that social cohesion was it's on its way, they wanted to be actors in problem solving and conflict mediation in their own communities. And what we saw then was when hard times struck, whether it was Ebola or armed insecurity or most recently COVID, the communities that had undergone this process, and the women in particular who had saved some money, formed into associations, and had been actively involved in conflict prevention, they were the ones that typically were more resilient and tended to keep the worst forms of violence at bay, including SGBV, during these fragile times. And so it goes to show, again, how women's empowerment is critical to stability and critical to resilience, which we know is very, very important, and increasingly so in this day and age. And finally, these same women went on to invest as environmental stewards. So there was a bit of an arc where there was a sequence to the types of activities and supports that built on one another to really transform gender bias in ASM. And there might be a formula here for supporting communities using a women's empowerment approach to go from survival to investment and essentially raise themselves out of poverty. I think there's still a lot of work to be done here in terms of mapping these kinds of processes and these kinds of pathways out of poverty that center women's empowerment. But it's certainly very promising. And this too has been perhaps validated in other sectors. We've seen it as well in Sudan. Now in that case, it was a project or a joint program implemented by UN Environment, UN Women, and the United Nations Development Program, where they're really training women in farming, natural resource management, and conflict resolution, in part as a result of men having left the community to go mine gold in another part of the country. And so women were left on their own, and they too focused on increasing incomes first, training new farming techniques, harvesting new crops, acquiring land, which also led to a degree of social cohesion. Women came together, but it was both the farming and the nomadic groups, and it created greater social unity and facilitated discussions on management of natural resources, which also led to conflict prevention initiatives led by these same women. So there was a similar pattern. It was in agriculture, but also in response to, a push factor away from land that had transformed due to climate change. Men had gone to go mine in other parts of the country, leaving women as women-headed households who needed support. But the same trajectory of economic security, social cohesion, conflict prevention was followed, which mirrors that of our experience with the communities we work with in the DRC, and it might be one worth following in other contexts. Finally, I just want to flag that perhaps on the horizon, and not too far a horizon, is the increasing emphasis or ability to measure whether or not we're realizing women's economic empowerment. There are proven indexes at an international level that compare country to country, but this is now being adapted to the artisanal mining context by my own organization with our partners in order to know and measure whether or not our support to these communities and communities' own initiative are essentially headed on the path of women's economic empowerment and gender equality. And these are tools, like I said, that have been adapted to other sectors and have typically been measured at national level, now adapted to artisanal mining. So those dimensions that I mentioned earlier, assets, income, leadership, production, time, these are all things that we can collect information and map apples to apples, community to community, country to country, to know whether or not we're on the right path. And so I think there's a very promising field emerging around this type of evidence that, that presents actionable data that allows us to learn what is really working and what isn't, and what's replicable in order to realize women's empowerment in the sector. And this is just another way of presenting it in various dashboards. It can be quite sophisticated, but definitely very granular and even real-time information at times. And so it's a very promising field. There's been a lot of change in the last 10 years, and we know that ASM can be a vector for women's economic empowerment and gender equality. And by sharing information and making sure that it's evidence-based, we can realize that together. So thank you very much.